What did you want to talk to about today, Ted?
Well, there's the New Deal and what they were doing with food at that time. That should surprise some folks.
Okay, so that's the part of my book that deals with the New Deal.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, and then there's do we own property? Really,
Okay.
is
And
another.
listen for the airplanes too.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess people have already figured out that we talk outside, and sometimes there are cats and dogs and bells and airplanes. But hey, we're not much into editing. We're into information. So if you can't, well, just try to hear.
Us, particularly us older folks, but I think 70 people heard. For some reason, I confabulated, and I thought that the LBJ sometimes used the term New Deal.
Well, what was LBJ's? What was
New
LBJ?
Society, I think he used
The Great Society.
Great Society.
Yeah, the Great Society was his.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, all that's fairly.
Okay, what most people don't know, and I didn't learn until I was, I was a young adult, and I had two little children, and they had a babysitter named Grandma French. And this is in Oklahoma, and she was she was actually in the Sooner Land Rush in I think 1890 something. And so when she was babysitting my children, she was in her 80s. Very spry, incredible woman, had strong fingernails, hair like you can't believe, good eyesight and hearing. So obviously French had taken care of herself during her lifetime. But we sat at the table one day and she drew for me the picture of the Depression as she remembered it. And I was absolutely shocked because I had no idea of the pogroms. Look that up, Pogroms, pogroms against the people that were instituted by FDR. FDR and Lincoln are held out to be great statesmen and great saviors of our country, when in fact they did exactly the opposite. It's very interesting about, well, of course, history. To the victor go the spoils, and that includes the writing of the history. But underneath it all, history will always repeat itself, and we don't seem to learn from that, so I guess that makes us idiots. Is that what Einstein said? If you continue to do the same thing over and over without any possibility of a different result. This is what French told me about the Depression. She was a milkmaid on a dairy farm when the Depression began. She had been there all along. She worked in the country, and so she wasn't caught up in the furor in the cities with all this mass suicides and the stock market crash and all the things that led to the Great Depression. Of course, she didn't own stock, so she wasn't, and I don't know that she even read the paper out where she lived. I have no idea. People in that day and age didn't have the internet, and the rural setting was different than a city setting. But for those of you that don't know the history, in 1929, they had the stock market collapse in the United States. In Germany, they had another kind of depression. These depressions and these crashes are always worldwide, and it's because there's a worldwide monetary system, and that's overseen by the International Monetary Fund. And so when one country collapses, another country collapses as well, so that it becomes worldwide, and it's all manipulated. So what happened here in the United States is people were buying stocks, and stocks were touted. And my word of caution to people always is, if your Aunt Mabel, who can't tie her shoes, knows to get into the stock market or tells you about a good deal in the stock market, don't listen and run as far as you can from that kind of advice. Because when this economic boon, or whatever it's reputed to be, trickles down to the little people who are generally ignorant of that stuff, it's over, and it's time to get out or flee. Anyway, everybody and their dog was buying stocks, because in those days, the stocks, you could be in the stock market, you could buy anything you wanted to for on margin. That means that you only had to plunk 10% down, and you would own the rest. But because the stock market was going up, 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 you would put in $1 today and it would be worth $100 tomorrow. So what did it matter if it was in margin? Because you were getting rich. Everybody was getting rich on paper. And of course, when the big riot, when the big push towards something is something like getting rich, it doesn't take long to catch on. Everybody hears by word of mouth, and so everybody gets in on the deal. It's like the oil boom in Midland, Texas. I mean, in Abilene. I went out there one time, and the guy I was working with said, we were looking for a new office building, and we'd go in, and I mean, these places were like Taj Mahal. They had copper walls and walnut walls and marble floors, and it was just, I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And in Abilene, Texas, and he said during the oil boom, when they experienced the oil boom in the 80s, everybody got rich. He said he had 2 barbers. They quit the barber business. It was hard for him to get a good haircut because the barbers could go to the bank, and they did go to the bank, and borrow $1 million on the premise that they were buying an oil rig, and they did. They bought an oil rig, barbers that didn't know a thing about the oil field, and it worked for a week or two, or a month or two, or a year or two, and then it all crashed down. It fell down, and people when they get caught up in that think it's going to last forever, and that's what happened in the 20s. At the end of the 20s, everybody thought this huge economic expansion was a way to get rich on very little money, and everybody got in. Well, the problem with buying on margin, only putting 10% down, is when it starts to slip and the broker issues a margin call, then it is incumbent on the person that owns or bought the stock to put in the remaining amount of money. And when the margin calls went out, and they waited until they had enough people trapped in this spider's nest, until they said whoops, and they tightened the credit, and the stock started to go down, and people scrambled. They had pledged everything they owned as collateral against the margin. They lost their homes, they lost their jobs. Well, the firms were in the market. They didn't have any jobs to offer. It was a huge domino fall, and everybody got caught in it, or almost everybody, and certainly anybody with ears and relativity to the stock market lost. So all these people lost everything they owned. People committed suicide. There was a gnashing of teeth and a mourning across the country because it was such an economic collapse, and the people hadn't been subject to this before. So, and it was the bankers. It was all orchestrated. It was all, it's a Hegelian principle. They create a problem and then they offer a solution. So by the 30s, that happened in 1929, so by the 30s, everything had said it, banks went bust, there were a run on banks, they didn't have any money, blah, blah, blah. So by the 1933s, which is between 33 and 39, I make no distinction about the particular year when all the draconian measures were implemented in the United States of America, across this country. But in the 30s, FDR was the savior. He was the one that was handpicked to come in and be the savior. And you notice that FDR had over 4 terms as president, and it was after his reign that it was written in that a president could only hold 2 terms in office. So he was the king, the king of the realm. And people to this day, diehard, stamp the feather off the rooster Democrats, still believe that FDR saved this country and he was the one. So, my friend French was a dairymaid on a dairy farm somewhere in Oklahoma. And in 1934, FDR was inaugurated in 1934, which is when he initiated his programs, whichever you want to say, against in favor of saving the United States. He depends on which side of the fence you're looking at. French was on this dairy farm, and one day there was this big noise as the trucks rolled onto the dairy farm. She said they had trucks with with wooden sides, and men that were crowded in that. Those were the men that were put in place on the dairy farm to implement the orders. And they brought in flatbeds with bulldozers. They brought in men with guns. And they herded all of the people on the dairy farm into the house, and they held them there while the men that had come in on the trucks went about their business. These men rounded up all the livestock on the farm, every cow, every other kind of livestock they had. And they dug this deep trench with their bulldozers, and then they drove the livestock down into the pit. And the men on the side stood and target shot every bit of that livestock and killed them all. And then the man with the bulldozer covered up the trench with all the livestock. And the livestock was all gone. Now, this is a dairy farm, so they didn't have any crops. But next door to the dairy farm was a wheat farmer. And these same men came in and they burned his crops. And they also killed his livestock, the livestock he had. So to the dairy farmer, they said this: "We are leaving you one cow, because we're kind and full of largesse. We are leaving you with one cow. That is to be the family cow. If we find out that one drop of that cow's milk goes to one of your neighbors for any reason, we will come back and kill the cow. So you're allowed the cow as long as it's only for you and your family's use." And of course, French had to drift in the Depression like all the other homeless, helpless, jobless people, just as in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. That's how it was. I can remember when I read everything all my life. I can remember when I was 12 or 13 and reading The Grapes of Wrath. I love Steinbeck. Nobody does prose like Steinbeck. And I actually read that book while up to my neck in the bathtub, because I couldn't stand, it was so real to me, I couldn't stand the dust and the dirt on my skin as I traveled through the Grapes of Wrath and the Oki struggle. But that they controlled, then the people that were, the people in the cities were told that there was a famine, that not only had the economic world collapsed, but God saw fit to put famine on the country. So there was a food shortage. And people are subject to propaganda wherever they are and wherever they live. And the people here in this country are just as subject to propaganda as the German people were to the Nazi regime. So the people in the cities were told there was a great famine on the land, and the stores and the commodities in the store became lesser and lesser, and they're really, because they couldn't get supplied. They had cut off the supply. However, the federal government retained enough to be able to feed the people in the kitchen food lines, in the soup lines. They created food lines. You can look at the pictures from the 30s. All these people standing with their utensils or their cup or whatever, standing in a food line waiting to be fed by the great, magnificent, munificent federal government. And by manipulating the food after all the other manipulations, FDR implemented his New Deal. And here's what the New Deal was: the takeover of the American people by the federal government. That's what it was. And everybody should know that there was a manipulation of food. Everybody should know that this government, what is in place, is not above starving people to death, or burning crops, or killing livestock in order to implement the end goal, and the end goal was to take over the people. Up until that time, the federal government wasn't allowed in the states. It had its place in Washington, D.C. And I totally recommend a lecture series from Hillsdale College, and it's easily accessible on the internet. Hillsdale College, Hillsdale College. The dean there gives a series of lectures on the Constitution and Declaration. But he says in his lecture, people don't understand or realize that the federal government deals with international issues. outside this border. They are there as a seat of government to deal with other seats of governments, to implement worldwide policy that is beneficial to the citizens of those countries that are negotiating. People don't know that. And the states are in place to implement domestic policy. Now you and I, we're subject to domestic policy, are we not? We live in Texas, and the laws in Texas control. Yet, these federal people come in and they dictate to us. And the food shortage was one of the ways that they manipulated that takeover. People became grateful to this savior. My dad had recently married. This is in 1938. My sister was born in 1938, and the Depression lasted that long. I mean, it lasted until almost the 40s. Well, it actually was just winding down when we went to war, and then we had boom because of the war.